And I'm not saying that right is wrong. That sounded weird.
Hello and welcome. My name is Steven Sorensen. I'm the creator of Ctruth, and this is Scholarly Snippets, Season 2, Episode 2. Scholarly Snippets is my show where I interview people with history degrees or related degrees in order to shed light on the world of history and historical scholarship. Today I'm joined by the Assyriologist, Dr. Josh Bowen. Dr. Josh has a Bachelor's of Science in Religion from Liberty University, a Master of Theology degree in the Old Testament from Capital Bible Seminary, a Master's degree in Near Eastern Studies from Johns Hopkins, and a PhD in Assyriology from Johns Hopkins that he got in 2017. He is an author, and we briefly discuss his books in this interview. As you watch, think of questions that you would have asked him that I didn't ask. Then comment those questions so I can get a better view of what you want to hear from my guests. Without further ado, here's the interview. Dr. Josh, thanks for joining me today. How are you doing?
Of course. Yeah, doing well. Thanks for having me on.
That's good to hear, and you're welcome. Thank you for joining me. You've been somewhat of a YouTube celebrity as of recently with the online academic community. Your book,
really, that's sad for the community that I'm the celebrity.
No, it's not. You're quite competent. You're well articulated. So I'm glad that you could spare some time out of your busy schedule to come talk with me. Your book is out. Is it still a #1 bestseller on Amazon?
It is. Yeah. Yeah. It kind of floats around. The Kindle is sometimes the #1. It's the Audible version has been at the top since it came out. So,
and what is the title of it again?
It's The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, Volume 1.
Right. And you have Volume 2 done yet, or?
No, most of it's worked out in outline form, and I just finished the chapter on the Exodus.
And I think I saw a tweet the other day talking about Volume 3 is in the works.
Yeah, it's all outlined. Yep.
Starting to incubate. So that is exciting. Let's start out here. What is Assyriology? You're a doctor of Assyriology, right?
Yeah.
So what is it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So a lot of people don't realize, I think, that, and when I say a lot of people, I'm thinking like a lot of fundamentalist evangelicals, while they might realize that they don't really take it as seriously, I think, as they should, that the Hebrew Bible is not this unique document in the ancient Near East, or this unique set of texts. And what I mean by that is there's this idea that the Bible is handed down by God in such a way that it's so progressive, and it leaves behind the ancient Near East and all the the heathen nations and the things that they produced. When in reality, there's actually an awful lot of continuity between what we see in the Hebrew Bible and what we see in the wider ancient Near East. And that's because it's an ancient Near Eastern set of texts. So how does one go about studying the languages and cultures that are in the ancient Near East that are not Egypt or, from the ancient Israelite culture? How do you get to know ancient Near Eastern culture? And Assyriology is one of the ways that you can do that. So if you think about where Iraq is today, Iraq and Syria, that land in between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, that's called Mesopotamia. And Mesopotamia was made up of the north and the south primarily, which later became the Assyrians in the north and the Babylonians in the south. And so Assyriology is just studying those languages and cultures that are in Mesopotamia. And, so you can study a lot of different periods. You can focus in on different periods. It's quite vast. Assyriology covers everywhere from roughly 3000 to 300 BCE. So it's a pretty wide range of time. And but that's what Assyriologist, if you get into Assyriology, you're going to learn Akkadian, you're going to learn Sumerian, you're going to study ancient Mesopotamian history, you're probably going to study ancient Israelite history, Egyptian history, depending on what program you go into. But that's its main thrust, is to try to get at the earliest writing systems. The earliest writing comes from Mesopotamia. We have all this fairly well documented history, at least from the archaeological record and from textual sources from ancient Mesopotamia. So it really, it's amazing to study it on its own terms, which is what I do. But now that I've come online, it's even it's just as useful, I think, for someone who is into the Hebrew Bible or into the Old Testament, but wants to really get the background for what was being written there and what was being done in the first millennium. So it's a really great field. You have another book too about learning a language. Is it Akkadian? Yeah, we've got 4 out at the moment. So this is, I have it sitting here because I'm teaching it on the Tang channel. Sumerian, every Sunday. What I was thinking of. Yeah, learn to read ancient Sumerian. So that was the first book that Megan and I published. And then I put out that book on Did the Bible Endorse Slavery? And then I published my dissertation as a popular level book, Learning to Pray in a Dead Language. And then the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. Cool. Thanks for your detailed and thorough answer on Assyriology. I feel like even I have learned something about the scope of the field. I didn't realize it was so extensive, up to 300 BC. So I appreciate that. Now, at what point does somebody who's interested in this become an Assyriologist, in your opinion? Yeah. So a lot of people come into Assyriology just because they're interested in the ancient world. But I think probably just as often, and I haven't looked at data on this or anything, this is just my anecdotal experience. A lot of people come into Assyriology through the Hebrew Bible. So what ends up, and that's how I got into it. So what ends up happening is a lot of people will go to seminary, right? They'll go to seminary and they'll start taking Greek so they can read the New Testament. Then the next year they start studying Hebrew so they can read the Old Testament. And if they really like Hebrew, maybe they'll start to learn Aramaic, like biblical Aramaic, so they can read the parts of the book of Daniel and Ezra, and there's a couple other verses here and there. And then if they stay, interested in Semitic languages, which is what Hebrew and Aramaic are, they might take Syriac, they might take Ugaritic, and they might take Akkadian. Akkadian, those are all, Semitic languages. And Akkadian has a very close relationship with Sumerian. And what you find out as you go through studying if you study it, I think with reputable scholars, you'll find very quickly that much of the Hebrew Bible has been significantly influenced by Akkadian and Sumerian literary texts and other types of texts. And so, if you're gonna really have this broad background to the Hebrew Bible, Assyriology is one of the ways to do that, because it gives you all of the developing literature that comes really from the inception of writing and how it develops and how scribes learn to go to school, how they went to school and how they learned, and the different texts that they copied out and the literature that was extant at the time. So all of those things sort of feed down into the first millennium and influence tremendously the writers of the Hebrew Bible. So that's one of the ways fairly popular way that I see people getting interested in Assyriology is through the Hebrew Bible. Another way, actually, that I didn't realize until I got on social media is that there's such a large presence of sort of ancient aliens. People talking about and thinking about ancient aliens. And so often that ties into Egyptian, with the pyramids and those sorts of things. But it seems like just as often with people like Zecharia Sitchin, it ties into Sumerian. And so people start like that Learn to Read Ancient Sumerian book has been incredibly popular. And I think it's popular a lot of times with people that are just interested in like that whole ancient aliens thing. And while I obviously think that's wrong, like I don't think that's accurate, historically speaking, I'm so happy that that's driving people to learn Sumerian and learn an ancient language like that, because I think it can only do everybody a world of good. So
yeah, that was an interesting response. I feel like it was more of like how do people get into Assyriology? But I was kind of asking about the line, like between somebody that has like a working knowledge of it almost, or like a kind of a conception, and when would you call someone an Assyriologist? Like,
oh, I see.
So like from being the novice, I've picked up how to read ancient Sumerian and I've skimmed through some of the pages, to considering this person an Assyriologist, or like enough like to give them the title of it.
I mean, I think probably for the most part, somebody doesn't become an Assyriologist until they've got a graduate degree. And even then, if it's a master's degree, like in Assyriology, a lot of times, I mean, so let me say it this way. I have a PhD in it, and anytime something comes up about Assyriology, unless I have absolutely read everything on it, all the secondary literature on it, and read most of the primary sources, I'll be the first person to say, look, this is a very vast field. It's very complicated. This isn't my area of specialization. And I have a PhD in it. So I think that's going to it's going to vary, I think, from person to person and context to context. But I think most of the time when people say he's an Assyriologist, it's someone that's at least gone and gotten a master's degree in Assyriology. And more common, I think, it's for people that have earned a PhD in the field.
Yeah.
But again, that's anecdotal.
No, thanks. Yeah, and that's what I was looking for, was just kind of your opinion. It might change in the future. It might stay the same, but it'll be interesting to see how time plays out. I've seen you on YouTube and talking to a lot of people, and I think if you ever hit the celebrity level where they start making a poll toy that makes you say stuff, you would say, well, this isn't my field, but and then that's what you would continue on with one of those things that you just said. No, it is.
It's so true.
It is definitely something you say. I've seen it. So you talked about ancient aliens a little bit. I was curious to get your take on Pseudoesteriology. Is that something that exists, or is there anything, because we have something called pseudo-history, and it's when historical arguments aren't really based on the evidence that they say they are. Do you run into this in Assyriology?
Yeah, that guy that I mentioned, Zecharia Sitchin, I think probably falls pretty squarely into that, or fell into that category. He's since passed, but I've got one of his books up on my shelf that I had to make my way through, called the 12th Planet. And one of the things that, if you don't know Sumerian, for example, if you don't know how to read the language, it can be kind of difficult to figure out that he maybe isn't the expert that people think he is. And one of the things that was very telling to me as I read through the book was that, and I won't go into detail here because it would probably kind of try, but the Sumerian words can be used at least two different ways, or Sumerian cuneiform signs. They can be used to represent nouns themselves. So there's a symbol called that's called the Dinger sign. It's a star symbol. It looks like a star. And it's the sign that's used when they want to write the word on. And on means sky or heaven. So A-N, on. However, So if you write the star symbol, you can just be saying sky or heaven, and that makes sense because it's a star, right? However, they learned pretty quickly when they were developing the writing system that you could use the sound of the word itself to create other words. So if you wanted to write the word Bandu in cuneiform, you could use the ba symbol, the ba sign, the an sign, and the do sign, and put them all together. So you're using them phonetically.
It's like jazzercise, almost.
Like maybe.
Jazz exercise. Or maybe.
Sort of.
Like you're mashing words together, right?
Yeah, sort of. But for a phonetic reason. So the example that I always give is...
Sorry to interrupt. I see what you're saying. I think you're saying that they're using just the noise of that.
Yes.
So it's not the actual
exactly
word with the meanings entailed. But that's right. I understand now. That makes sense.
So yeah, and that, the example I think that is always most clear for the audience is if I were to go to a graduation and they were to say, look, we're going to read everybody's name out. Some people have funny sounding names that we don't know how to pronounce, or they look funny, whatever. Can you write your names out phonetically? I wouldn't write Joshua because that's not phonetic. That's how it's spelled. Instead, I would write JAH-SHOE-WAH, Joshua. Well, the word shoe in the middle, SHOE, has nothing to do with footwear, right? As you said, we're just using that word for its sound, not for its meaning.
Yep. And it wouldn't make sense to put a shoe on your jaw.
Right, exactly. But what happens is when you read through, to bring it back to Sitchin, when you read through his book, he'll have these verbal forms written out in Sumerian. And you look at them and you say, okay, well, I know what that Sumerian verb is, but it's made up of 3 or 4 different signs. And instead, I know it's just those 3 or 4 signs are being mashed together to make the pronunciation of one word. But what he's doing is he's saying, okay, well, on here, that means sky. And then do here means to build. And so undo, all right, so it's the building of the sky. And you're like, no. There's no meaning individually. It's just all those signs get put together to make that one word using their sounds. Anyway, that was probably overly technical. If you're interested in that, audience, stop by on Sunday evenings at 7:30 Eastern to the Atheist Network Group's channel, and you can learn Sumerian. And that will make sense to you. But reading that stuff and you say, well, gosh, he just doesn't know Sumerian. And so much of what he says is predicated on him knowing Sumerian. So, I mean, I think that's Pseudoesteriology, sort of quintessentially.
Right, where they're not using the source material how it actually is. It's a poor reading at best.
Yeah, at best.
Thanks for answering my question about Pseudoesteriology and for the phonetic linguistic lesson as well. I appreciate that.
Wake up, everyone. Wake up.
Right. It's time to pay attention again. We're about to hear what, Dr. Josh, how did you get interested in this field specifically? What you mentioned how other people get brought into it, but what's your background here?
Yeah, so, I was a fundamentalist evangelical Christian for 25 or 26 years. And after I joined the Air Force, I wanted to become a chaplain. So I went and got a bachelor's degree at Liberty University in religion. And then I enrolled in a seminary to go get a master's degree so that I could become a chaplain in the Air Force. And so I didn't realize until I got to seminary that I wasn't a completely stupid person. Because up to that point, I felt, I didn't do very well in high school. I didn't really pay attention. I kind of goofed off. And, even through the bachelor's degree, it was like, I did okay, but not great. When I got to seminary, they started teaching me languages, ancient languages. And I feel like I took to it like a fish takes to water. And I loved it. So I dove into Greek. I, learned Koine Greek. And at the same time, I started diving into Hebrew. And once I learned Hebrew, I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. So I started studying Aramaic. Then I started studying Ugaritic and Syriac. Then I picked up Akkadian. And as I was studying Akkadian, I was coming closer to the end of my time at seminary. And I said to one of my professors who was going to Catholic University at the time, and I said, look, what do you recommend? And he said, well, if you want to be like a top tier Old Testament scholar, you want to go learn Akkadian and you want to learn it really, really well. So my initial motivation for getting into Seriology was just to really learn Akkadian really well. So I applied to Johns Hopkins University. And when I got there and interviewed, I talked to who had then become my professor and advisor, Paul Del Nero, and absolutely fell in love with Sumerian. It was amazing. So Sumerian and Akkadian, it's just all I wanted to do. So of course when I was accepted, I took the full complement of all the Sumerian and Akkadian that I could take, but also took tons of Hebrew. I took Hebrew epigraphy. I took biblical archaeology. I took regular Near Eastern archaeology. I Mesopotamian history, Syro-Pal history, Egyptian history, all that stuff. But my focus became just to learn Sumerian and Akkadian and all the literature and all the history and the documentation, the textual evidence, the archaeological evidence that we have to understand this, incredibly important set of cultures. And so that's what brought me into it. It's only been since I've come onto social media that I've sort of now had a foot in both camps. At first I really focused during seminary, really focused on the Old Testament. Then when I got to, my PhD program, it was much more about Seriology, although I still did a lot of Hebrew. And now it's like, I feel like it's a balance of both here online, where I'm talking about Hebrew Bible stuff all the time, but then I'm talking about ancient Near Eastern stuff all the time. So it's a really good balance for me.
Yep. Thanks for sharing that. So basically you thought you were pretty dumb all around, and then you, like a fish to the water, turned into a Leviathan of Assyriology.
My grandfather used to always say, last year I couldn't even spell engineer, and now I are one. And that's kind of how I felt.
So how long have you been in this field for?
I guess strictly in Assyriology since 2009, when I started at Hopkins. If we're counting my Hebrew Bible stuff toward that, which again isn't strictly Assyriology, I started that degree in 2003. So I was in grad school for 15 years studying ancient Near Eastern languages. So it's been a little while, but I mean, obviously there are many Assyriologists that have either been in the field much longer than I have and or are much better at Assyriology than I am. So I'm just happy that I've had the opportunity to study where I did and learn what I did and write what I did for my dissertation. So phenomenal experience. And I think it's sort of setting me up well to do what I do here online.
Well, thanks for answering that. What were your favorite parts of this experience?
I think being able to, I remember going to the British Museum after I'd been studying Sumerian for, a semester and a half. And we were walking around in the Near Eastern section, and there was an inscription behind the glass. I remember looking at it, it was in Sumerian, and I went, oh, I can read that, and actually it was probably one of these inscriptions. So in the back of this book, Megan has taken time to really draw these things out nicely for exercises. So it was probably one of those. But I remember looking at it and going, oh my gosh, I know what that says. Not only did I understand the signs, the cuneiform signs and what they meant, but how they went together, And so I think for me, it was being able to pick up these hand copies of these cuneiform tablets. So what looked to me before just like a chicken walking around on clay, and to be able to pick it up and go, that makes sense to me. I know what that says. It was a pretty amazing experience. I guess the other thing that was really fun for me was seeing how everything from a historical standpoint and an archaeological standpoint sort of tie together in the end. And I remember when I studied for during my PhD program, we had to take 3 years of intense coursework. And then at the end, you studied essentially for 12 hours a day for 5 to 6 months. And then you took these, what they call comprehensive examinations. And they're just an exam per subject that you've studied and that they're going to test you out of essentially to make sure you learned everything that you needed to learn. So I remember studying, like I had an Akkadian language one, a Sumerian language one, a Mesopotamian history one, and a Hebrew language exam. And I remember studying for all of those things. And the way you studied is essentially to learn everything about everything. Like that those are the instructions. Learn everything about everything. We can ask you anything about these topics. So by the end, you had this incredibly broad and somewhat deep understanding of all of these issues surrounding Assyriology and the Hebrew Bible. And it was so neat because it was at that moment that I could go to a conference and interact with anybody and have a good idea about what they were working on. And I could ask them interesting questions about what they were working on because I knew something about the topic. So that was a pretty cool experience.
So from what I gathered from your response there is that you really enjoyed the practical application. You could apply your knowledge to what you were seeing in the museum. You're like, this makes sense. It's not all Greek to me, or French, or any language that somebody might not speak. It's not alphabet soup anymore.
Right.
I like the chicken walking on the tablet thing. It is kind of what it looks like a little bit.
Yeah.
And then also, aside from the practical application, was your ability to connect with others who were kind of in the same path. They're researching things, maybe not the same things. And I'm sure that this is kind of when you started to foster the whole, this isn't my field, but I did read about this. So.
Yes. I know something about it, but not as much as you.
Of course not. No. That's great. I'm curious now, what were the most challenging aspects that you've run into throughout your time?
When I got to Hopkins, I was the only Assyriology student in the program at the time. And I was my advisor's first student. And, Paul Donnero is a brilliant guy. There's no question about it. And I remember sitting in his office and saying, listen, don't take it easy on me. Like, push me as hard as you can, push me. Because I want to be the best Assyriologist out there. That's what I told him. It was the biggest mistake of my life. No, half kidding. Because he took that to heart. And I remember, coming in one day and he put these pieces of paper in front of us that were just hand copies, just drawings of cuneiform tablets. And it was like our second semester of Sumerian, right? We didn't know a lot. And he said, read that. And Sumerian is very difficult to read. There's just no question. If you learn it correctly, we can do it. But the way that was, it was just put it down in front of you and read it. And so I kind of stumbled my way through some of it. And he was like visually frustrated with me. And he said, look, this is a temple list. It shows the name of the temple and the city that it's in. was like, oh, okay, I see it. That's cool. Well, then we went and did our Sumerian grammar lesson. So the next week he came in and he slapped another piece of paper in front of me and he said, read that. And so I looked at it and I said, and he said, I can't believe this. What are you doing with your time? It's another temple list. And I gave you that one, Lat. You're supposed to go home and memorize these things. Oh my gosh. Okay. So that week, he taught us about this set of 10 literary pieces of literature called the Decad. And there's 10 Sumerian texts. And they were studied in a particular order by scribal students. And he wrote his dissertation on them. So he taught us these things just sort of in passing. Well, I went home and memorized them in order. Like I could, if you had said, tell me the Decad, I could have just listed them all for you. Because I just knew the next week he was going to ask us. Didn't ask me. Next week, week after. 3.5 years later, I'm sitting in this Sumerian class, and he says, so this is one of the texts of the Decad. Josh, what are the texts of the Decad? Well, I had memorized them using this, what's it called? An acronym. And the acronym was, she loves songs, in every kite, even I need gold.
Is that what you said to him?
It was worse. I went, yeah, there's like all these other students in the room, and I got my hands on my head and I said, Shulgi, Lipidishtare, the Song of the Hoe. And he said, what are you, channeling an ancient scribe? But I got them all because I was saying that acronym in my head. Anyway, that was the sort of stuff that these programs, depending on which one you go into, they're phenomenal programs, but you've got to progress very, very quickly so they can be monumentally difficult. So like mental health becomes a real thing. People trying to watch other people's mental health states is a very real thing. Depression can set in very quickly in some of these programs because you have a short amount of time to learn so much material. So the hardest part, I think, was, besides the fact that I was getting up at 5:30 and studying until 9:30 at night. Besides that, it was just trying to find some semblance of a little bit of balance in my life because I was married with 2 kids at the time. And so that was difficult to do. It's very difficult to manage that successfully.
So the challenges were just the program in itself it requires a lot of time and effort, and you didn't do yourself any favors by asking for the book to be thrown at you, and as well as mental health, which is important, being able to keep a good balance to not depression sets in quick. I would imagine it can be anxiety inducing to have to meet deadlines. You get hit with some temple lists 2 weeks in a row and you're just expecting them every week next, and they don't appear again for 3.5 years, and then you have to channel spirits, and
that's right.
That can be difficult.
You got it.
I can see it. Yeah, I'm starting to get a picture here of what goes down in the Assyriology departments. No, but thanks for sharing that. People go through a lot of challenges. There's obviously only 2 of them, but life can be difficult. So you mentioned being in the field for some, at least 10 years, if not, you could trace it possibly back to 20 if you're counting some language studies. But have you noticed any changes in the field?
Actually, yeah. And I want to be careful how I say this, but I feel like actually Megan and I have been part of a change in the field. I wouldn't say that we started it at all.
What is this?
But I feel like we've moved it forward to some degree, and that is bringing this really sometimes very esoteric field that is filled with absolutely brilliant scholars who are quite often very much caught up in their own research, which they need to be to move the field forward. But sometimes it's so much so that they don't actually get that information in a palatable way to interested non-specialists. And I feel like Digital Hammurabi, the channel that Megan runs, that I help her with, I feel like we're actually making a difference in that regard. So one of the things that you'll see now is you see a lot of Assyriologists on Twitter, right? You're starting to see more Assyriologists doing podcasts. John Taylor out at the British Museum is now doing a podcast called The Thin Edge of the Wedge about, cuneiform. And he's a brilliant scholar. But he does his own podcast talking about this sort of thing. But the point is that, this grammar, we wrote this Learn to Read Ancient Sumerian book, not because there aren't other Sumerian grammars out there, but because there isn't a Sumerian grammar that's accessible to somebody that doesn't already know Sumerian, right? If you know English and you're going into the 10th grade and you pick up a 10th grade English book, that's fine. But you don't give somebody that's never spoken any English before or read any English before a 10th grade English book. That won't do them any good. So the point is that hopefully what we're doing, and I do feel like it's moving this way, is we're getting people that are obviously very intelligent. I mean, like our listeners, our audience, very, very bright. No question about it. I'm sure yours is the same way. And they're interested in these things, but giving them access to good scholarship in the field and actual effective ways of learning some of these things, like even something as complex as Sumerian, in a way that's actually possible. I think what will happen is what I'm hoping is, and I think we're starting to see it already, is that this area of the humanities, ancient Near Eastern studies, won't die off and shrink, but instead, I'm hoping that a new wave of bright, interested people that are coming into university age or finishing up at the college level and going into grad school, that they'll be interested in this field because they see that it's not only accessible, but it's interesting. And it can tell you so much about other things that more mainstream people are interested in, like the Bible, for example. And so I feel like the field is starting to recognize that doing public outreach like this is not futile and is not worthless. People like Eric Klein, who wrote the book 1177 on the Collapse of Civilization, he's always been a big fan of doing a public outreach and bringing people in, new people in. And I think that's how the field's going to stay relevant, is staying relevant to the public. And I think that's what makes our position here, sort of in our off time, in our spare time, when I'm not working and when Megan's not feeding babies, we can help to bring those experts that are doing cutting edge research and be a liaison, connection between them and people that are interested out here online, but maybe don't have other ways to access them and to make that information palatable and exciting to them.
So what I heard is that you have seen a upspike in public outreach from the field of Assyriology. You're getting more experts on Twitter, on social media. Your Digital Hammurabi has been somewhat of a spearhead in this. And I mean, if I were to think of Assyriology channels, I don't know if I could think of any others aside from Digital Hammurabi. So I think there is some truth behind what you're saying here. What is the most controversial thing that you deal with in Assyriology?
I mean, besides the ancient alien stuff, because it's certainly controversial to a large group of people, but it's not controversial like in the field itself. So there are obviously certain topics that are very controversial. I would say there's in my sphere, there's a lot of debate about how much intertextuality, how much interaction, borrowing, those sorts of things took place between Akkadian and Sumerian literature and mythology and what we see in the Hebrew Bible. So there are some people that would say there's, maximal levels of it. And so somebody like Wright would say, for example, that the Code of Hammurabi is essentially being copied out. I mean, not quite that extreme, but is directly being reworked in Exodus 21 and the Covenant Code. Whereas other people would say, there are allusions to it. There's sort of a general tradition that stands behind some of these legal aspects, but how much, can we picture the scribe of the Hebrew Bible or of Exodus like sitting there and thinking about the Code of Hammurabi or looking at a copy of the Code of Hammurabi?
He's something? Like, how can I reword this to pass the Turnitin test?
Right, and these are like, there's a spectrum, right? So, and there are absolutely some, and I'm not saying that Wright is wrong. That sounded weird. I'm not saying that the scholar Wright is wrong about his what he's concluded, because there are good scholars on that side. I probably wouldn't go quite as extreme, but it doesn't matter for this discussion. But how much of a dependence is there, for example, in Genesis 1 and 2, or even 3 and 4, on ancient Near Eastern texts, and which ancient Near Eastern texts? So I see a lot of that. And sort of the arguments for more maximalist or more minimalist views of those sorts of things. But that's a pretty popular one that I see like in my particular sphere.
So just how much are these people influencing each other is somewhat of a controversial topic in the field. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So thanks for that. What is the most controversial position that you hold in your field, if you can think of any?
I guess I'm kind of known for not holding controversial positions, primarily because of what I think my job is here online. And I feel like my role is to present consensus scholarship, because I think that's what good scholarship is. Right? People shouldn't be starting, if you're a non-specialist or if you're coming into a particular field, you don't want to latch onto the controversial things first, because all you're going to be doing at that point is, without having a sufficient background to make an educated decision on which controversial, way you want to go, you're just going to end up picking one, right? Without knowing all the background to each of the positions. So I think that the place everybody should be starting is, what is it that everybody agrees on? Let's start there. What's everybody agree on? Now, with that being said, the one thing that, I talked about in my own dissertation was that there are my dissertation deals a lot with these Sumerian texts that were written not as they were spelled, but as we were talking about earlier, as they sounded. So instead of writing, if I wanted to write out the word dogs phonetically, I wouldn't write DOGS, because that's how it's spelled. If I wanted to write it as it sounds, I would write DOGZ, dogs. And so these texts are written out phonetically as they sound. And so there's been some debate, like, well, why are they written this way? And some people have thought, well, the scribes just didn't know what they were doing. Others, had my opinion on this ended up being in a more nuanced way, that they're to help the participant in a particular ritual be able to pronounce the words, without actually having to know the language or what the texts are actually saying. But I don't know how controversial it is in that I don't think anybody's reviewed it because it's just in a dissertation form now. I haven't published it as an academic work. So people are reticent to review dissertations. But I mean, that's certainly not a consensus position as far as I know. So I guess that could be one.
So you're known for not being controversial, but if you had to pick on something that you knew, it would be the idea that some of these cuneiform tablets are written in certain ways that the person who might not know how to say the word would be able to say the word.
Yeah. Yep. So if I were to write out, Hebrew for you, if you didn't know Hebrew, Stephen, I don't know, maybe you're a Hebrew expert. I'm not sure.
I'm not a Hebrew expert. Okay. No.
So if I wanted you to pronounce Genesis 1, Genesis 1:1, I wouldn't write out in Hebrew, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. I would write out B-E-R.
Right, I get the idea.
In English characters.
Yeah, the phonetic way of saying it.
Well, you would be able to pronounce it. It might that if I took my time and actually showed you where you're supposed to put the accent on every word.
This does go back to what you were saying earlier. If people with unpopular names, to write them out in a phonetic way so that you can present them and say their name properly in front of the crowd. So
you could do that.
Kind of makes sense. Maybe some of that has leaked into your ideas on cuneiform a little bit. That's carrying over. Who knows? Thanks. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I was curious about the methodology that's used in Assyriology. How do you go about studying ancient, what was it, northern Mesopotamia?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to depend on what you're trying to do. So if you're trying to say, all right, let's try to figure out what's going on at this particular site. There are going to be lots of different things that you need to do. First, and a little message has just popped up on my screen, and I don't want it to. Sorry, I just don't want anything to reset. There we go. So if you're trying to figure out what this particular site, we want to figure out what was life like. Or tie it into history somehow. There are lots of different avenues that you'd have to come at. So as you excavate down, as the archaeologists dig down, they find pottery, right? Different types of pottery as they go down. And say, okay, here's cooking pots, and here are fragments of jars or different vessels. And they give us certain information about what's going on at the site. Well, then they start coming down on walls, right? And they start to uncover those walls, and they determine this is a residential area here, or this is the city wall, or here's the temple, right? And they can determine those things from the thickness of walls or different bits of material culture that are in there. Like if you have an altar of some sort, or the ashes or the bones and ashes of fish. You might on top of something that looks like an altar, you might say this is a cultic area. So all of those things archaeologically start to factor in. Well, let's say then you dig down and you come across tablets, cuneiform tablets. Well, now there are two aspects that you need to look at. You have to look at the tablets themselves as material culture. So they tell you, all right, well, for example, if you go to the city of Ebla, they found all of these tablets like in a row, as if they'd been up on wooden shelves, and the shelves had burned and they just all fallen down. Right. So that tells you that they are almost like in situ, in place, in their original place where they were when the thing was destroyed. And so you say, okay, well, this must have been a scribal type of room. And you can tell from different shapes of tablets, maybe how they were used. If they're small, tags, maybe they were placed on baskets to label the baskets or whatever. But then that's when you turn to the writing itself. Now, most people just want to go right to the writing, right? And see what does the text actually say.
Is there a word for eggs?
For eggs?
Eggs, to label a basket with eggs in it.
Oh, I don't know if there's a word for eggs in Sumerian.
It's one of the best selling foods out there.
But once you get to the stage where you're reading through what's actually on the tablet, now you're dealing in a completely different dimension, right? A completely new aspect of the text. So most people just read texts. They're tempted to read text devoid of the material culture that they're written on. But you can't do that. You got to be careful to pay attention to both. So that means that, if you end up reading a bunch of mythological texts and you don't pay attention, you find all these tablets and they have all these mythological texts on them. You might say, oh my gosh, well, this must be like a religious center or something. Well, if you don't pay attention to the material culture and the rest of the archaeological evidence, you might come away with that conclusion. But it turns out at the city of Nippur and at the city of Ur and at the city of Kish and some of these other cities, there are lots of mythological texts that show up on tablets that are in scribal schools. And we know they're in scribal schools. Like you can tell from the rest of the archaeology, this is a school setting. So then you learn, oh gosh, this is how they learned to write. They copied out these mythologies. Well, that takes you a completely different direction. Right now, this isn't some religious center where they're all sitting around and thinking about theology. If anything, this is like an indoctrination center, right? They're learning to write by certain texts being put into the scribal curriculum. So anyway, it's a very complicated thing. Lots of different lines of information, sources of information that have to be taken into account to come. So all these different data points that you're having to then put together into a model of interpretation that, like with anything else, best explains and accounts for the different data points.
Right. It sounds like you make use of forensic sciences and textual sciences. So, yeah, you do kind of come at it from every angle because you've got the archaeology and then you've got to figure out what are you reading even. Is this a sign for eggs? Is it a religious type thing? We got to get down to the bottom of this. So, it's interesting because it sounds like there's a lot of overlap between what historians do and what Assyriologists do. But when we were chatting beforehand, it seemed like you were drawing a hard line between the two. What is the difference between a historian and a Assyriologist?
I don't know that there is a hard line. I would say for me, I'm not comfortable discussing things as a historian, because I think a historian is there are certain Assyriologists that are historians, right? The first one that always comes to my mind is Mario Liverani. Liverani writes an awful lot about history, or Mark van der Meerop. These guys write a lot about history, but there are certain historical methodologies that while I'm acquainted with them, I'm much more a linguist. I'm much more focused on the languages and even the archaeology. So those things are utilized, obviously, to write history. But it's a specific, I think as you well know, it's a specific skill set to do history writing. And while I think I can do it, there are people that are actually trained in it in the field, and I wasn't formally trained in historiography. So that's why I'm, if there are a bunch of questions about how do you do historiography in that particular context, as I say, it's not my area of specialization. So that's just how I am.
Thanks for clarifying that. Because you know more about Assyrian history than I would think most people in the world do, since you've studied it for so long. So I was curious about where is the line between, the Assyriologist and the historian, because it seems like it's like a mixture of being an archaeologist and a historian. And then if you're a mix of that and you specialize in Assyriology or like Assyrian studies, then that's kind of it. But so yeah, it does kind of, the toolkits overlap a little bit here and there in the field. You have your PhD, you have a number of degrees. Is it ever cross your mind to get another one? And if so, what would you get?
That's fair. My gut reaction is not if I want to stay married. But I don't know that that's necessarily true. Obviously, Megan is very intellectual herself. She's, finishing up her PhD as well. So if I did, honestly, I would probably go back to school for New Testament, or early New Testament studies, because it's something that I have 6 years of Koine Greek. I've translated through a lot of the New Testament in the original. And I've done lots of textual criticism, but it was as a fundamentalist evangelical. So because of that, a lot of my interpretive models are just wrong. So assuming Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? Those sorts of things. So it just doesn't work. So I would want to go back and get a really good feel for what scholars in the field say about those things. So yeah, maybe New Testament studies. Maybe. We'll see.
Yeah, that makes
sense. So young enough.
It would be very relevant to you as an evangelical Christian for 2.5 decades, and it's also to the public, since you have such a love for public outreach. The Bible is one of the most, if not the most popular book in America and other countries. So that makes sense. And New Testament studies, that would really tie in with your Seriology, because that's basically Old Testament studies, or Old Testament studies does fall into Seriology, right?
Yeah, they definitely overlap.
Cool. So just wrapping up here, we're at the top of the hour. I give everybody a chance on my show to kind of give a message to people who are newcomers to the field. Maybe they have just very minor experience of learning. They've just picked up your book. Or what would you give as a message to some of these people as a encouragement or caution?
You can do it. There's no question about it. I am not I'm not a intellectually gifted individual, right? I'm not working with a different deck of cards at all. It doesn't take a brilliant person to get a PhD. It takes a person that works very hard and doesn't give up. That's what it takes. I got out of high school with a 2.495 GPA, right? I was not very good. You have to just grab onto something that motivates you, something that you love, and stick with it. But what I would say as you go in, if you're in grad school, or even if you're in, starting at a bachelor's degree or something, stay with the consensus for a long time. And what I mean by that is there's this temptation. I went through it. We all go through it. There's this temptation to, once you start to learn a language, for example, you start to learn Greek. You see it a lot with New Testament Greek. All of a sudden, you are coming up with brand new sermons and insights into these texts that nobody's ever seen before. Actually, this was in the subjunctive. And so that means that if you think about it with this other verse, just take a breather, learn a lot, learn what the consensus of scholars say about all the major issues before you start trying to develop your own theories, right? Because what will happen is the more broadly you apply your knowledge or your efforts to gain knowledge in these different areas, the broader your base that's founded on what most everybody agrees on, it's from that base that you will see connections in the different areas that you study, which will then allow you to more effectively say, I have a theory about this. And actually, I know what everybody says about this other topic and how it connects to it. And so I can start to draw things together to lead to my new innovative conclusion, the thing that you'll write your dissertation on. So don't get ahead of yourself. Stay humble and try to learn what all the experts in the field say about particular topics, and take that stuff very, very seriously.
Thanks for the message. So to summarize it, find something that you're passionate about, learn everything you can about it, and don't be too hasty when generating your convictions.
Yep.
Dr. Josh, thanks for joining me. Do you want to promote yourself at all? Where can people find you, find your work at?
Yeah, we're at Digital Hammurabi, HAMMURABI, either .com or that's our name of our YouTube channel. If you go to Amazon and type in Joshua Bowen, Bowen, all of our books and stuff will come up. So you'll be able to find us that way too. But I'm going to be speaking if the conference does go on. There's a conference called the Better Conference that the Atheist Network Group is putting on out in October 9th and 10th out in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And that's going to be a lot of fun. Seth Andrews is going to be out there, Anthony Magnabosco, Tom Jump, Cynthia McDonald. It's going to be a real good time. And I'll be giving one of the talks out there on how to have better communication, better interactions with people with whom we disagree. So it should be good.
Yeah, sounds like it'll be an interesting talk. Do you know if that'll be recorded?
Yes.
Great.
It will.
All right. Well, you heard it here, and there will be links to all that in the description of this video. So once again, Dr. Josh, thanks for joining me. Had a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you.
I reached out to Dr. Josh after the interview to ask him about the opening quote at the beginning of this episode. I asked how much of it he agrees with and what dangers can come from people who don't know much about scholars and historians speaking as if they did. He said, "I think the biggest problem is non-specialists thinking they know how to interpret the data based on seemingly valid, but completely erroneous, methodology." Thank you, Dr. Josh, for your response. Be sure to drop any other questions you wished I had asked below in the comment section. And before I go, I owe the Ctruth patrons a huge thanks for their continued support in my endeavor to explore the world of chronology. Thank you all. Like the video, hit the subscribe button, drop a comment, and check out these other videos.